A clean English home once took 30 minutes a day, not 30 minutes a week. The families who kept it that way never bought a single bottle of shop cleaner in their lives, and their homes stayed spotless through mud, coal, smoke, and children tramping in and out from dawn until dark. I grew up in a farmhouse in the Yorkshire Dales, in a valley where the wind came down off the fells and found every gap in the stonework. My grandfather ran that house on habits he had learned from his own mother, and she had learned them from hers, going back further than anyone in the family could put a date to. There was no council rubbish collection to speak of out there, no cupboard full of sprays, no van coming round the lanes selling polish and bleach to farm wives who had never needed either. There was a routine instead, done properly, in the same order, every single day, and it never once took longer than half an hour to finish. I watched it done from the time I was old enough to hold a cloth without dropping it, and by the age of 10, I could carry out most of it myself without being told. My grandmother would say the house looked after itself if you looked after it first thing, and she meant that quite literally. There was no washing machine in that kitchen until well into the 1960s, no vacuum cleaner until later still, and yet visitors from the village would remark on how the place shone. Neighboring farms ran the same routine with only small local variations. A habit passed hand to hand along the valley rather than written down anywhere, because nobody thought to write down something everyone already knew. The methods you are about to hear come from that same source, tested in that same kitchen, not gathered secondhand from some old pamphlet I found in a drawer. I share these because fewer and fewer people still hold onto them, and once a habit like this skips a generation, it very rarely finds its way back on its own. I am not telling you any of this because I read it in a book somewhere. I am telling you because I lived inside that routine for the better part of my childhood, in a house that stayed clean through every kind of weather a Yorkshire winter could throw at it. Somewhere along the way, cleaning stopped being a daily habit and became an entire industry built on convincing people that habit was no longer enough. Shelves that once held nothing more than a sack of salt, a bottle of vinegar, and a tin of beeswax now hold 40 different bottles and sprays, each one promising to do a job that a farmhouse kitchen once managed with 3 plain ingredients and a bit of proper elbow grease. The companies filling those shelves have very little interest in you knowing that a jar of bicarbonate of soda and a cut lemon can outperform half of what sits in a modern cleaning aisle, and there was never much profit to be made in telling people the truth about it. A tin of beeswax lasts a household the better part of a year and costs almost nothing. And there is simply no version of a modern business that can be built on a product like that. I will leave that thought there because it is not really what this video is about. What you are about to hear is not a theory dressed up as tradition for the sake of a good story. This is the actual 30-minute routine that kept farmhouses across the north of England spotless for generations, tested through wet winters, coal dust, and mud that came in on every boot by people who had no other choice but to make it work properly. It worked. Then, it worked through wars and rationing when nothing else was available, and I still use every part of it in my own home today. The first thing to understand is that the old routine never treated the whole house as one large, dreaded job the way we tend to now. It was broken down into small, fast tasks, each one suited to a particular part of the home, and each one taking only a few minutes once. You had the knack of doing it properly. My grandmother always began at the hearth, because in those days the fire was the first thing lit and the last thing banked down each night, and cold ash gathered there before anything else in the house was touched. She would let the ash cool fully overnight, then sweep it into a metal pail with a stiff hearth brush, always working from the back of the grate forward so the dust settled downward. Rather than lifting up into the room to land on everything else, cold wood ash was never once wasted in that house. A cupful went into a bowl with a small splash of water to make a thick gray paste, and that paste was rubbed onto the glass of the stove door with a soft rag, then wiped away clean with a second dry one. It cut through baked-on soot in a way that left the glass genuinely clear, not smeared the way a shop-bought spray so often leaves it. The whole hearth, from ash pail to glass to hearthstone, took no more than 4 minutes once the habit was formed. During the war years, when shop-bought polish was simply unavailable to most families, this ash paste was one of the few methods that never once let anybody down, and it appears again and again in the ration-era diaries that survive from farming households across Yorkshire and Lancashire. It cost nothing beyond what the fire had already produced, and it never needed to be bought, queued for, or rationed at all. For a household burning wood or coal every day of the year, the ash simply kept coming, so the supply never once ran short, even in the leanest winters. Keep that ash paste in mind as we go on, because it is not the last time wood ash shows up in this routine. And the second use of it surprises most people who try it for the first time. The second task was the windows, and this is where a great many viewers write to tell me their windows still streak, no matter what they buy from the shop. The old method used plain white vinegar, mixed half and half with water in a jug, applied to the glass with a rag rather than sprayed on from a bottle that leaves droplets sitting in patches. The real trick that made the difference was never the vinegar itself, it was what you dried the glass with. Afterward, newspaper screwed loosely into a soft ball rather than folded flat was used in place of cloth because the print and the fiber of the paper left behind no lint and pulled every last trace of moisture off the glass in a single pass. My grandfather always swore that a window dried with newspaper would still be perfectly clear a fortnight later, long after a window dried with cloth had already gone dull and streaky again. This took perhaps 5 minutes for a small farmhouse window done once a week rather than every day, and in all the years I watched it done, it never once needed a second wipe to finish the job. Larger farmhouse windows, the kind with small leaded panes common across the dales, took closer to 10 minutes, but even then the method never changed, only the time spent repeating the same simple motion, pane by pane. This is only the second task on the list, and the third one is where the routine really starts to show its full value, so stay with me. The third task, and this is where most people are genuinely surprised at how simple the old method really was, concerned the floor itself. Stone-flagged floors, which most farmhouse kitchens had underfoot, were swept first with a stiff broom, then mopped with hot water, carrying a small handful of ordinary salt and a splash of vinegar stirred through it. The salt was never there for flavor. It worked as a gentle abrasive that lifted ground and dirt from between the stones without ever scratching the surface, while the vinegar cut straight through the boot grease and cooking fat that gathered there through the day. Wooden floors in the parlor and front rooms were treated quite differently, because standing water was the real enemy of a good wood floor. Those floors were swept dry, then rubbed with a cloth carrying a small amount of beeswax mixed with a touch of turpentine, worked in along the grain, and buffed afterward with a dry cloth until the wood took on a proper shine. That polish was never reapplied daily, and it did not need to be. Once it was done properly, it lasted a month or more, and the daily routine after that only called for a dry sweep and a quick buff to keep the shine alive underfoot. This single step is very likely the reason old farmhouse floors from 100 years ago still shine when you see them preserved in surviving cottages today, long after the family that laid that shine has passed on. My grandmother kept a small tin of this beeswax mixture on a shelf by the back door for exactly this purpose, and it was one of the few household items that was never once allowed to run dry, replenished the moment it grew thin. It is worth remembering that this same wax and turpentine mixture worked equally well on wooden stairs, skirting boards, and even the wooden handles of tools, so very little of what was made ever went to waste. Even when turpentine was scarce during rationing, a little extra warmth applied to the wax itself was enough to soften it for spreading, and the results were nearly as good. The fourth task was the kitchen table and worktop, and in a house without any refrigeration this mattered a great deal more than most people realize now. Bicarbonate of soda, sprinkled dry directly across the wood or stone surface, then scrubbed in with a damp brush using small circular motions. Lifted grease and food residue without leaving behind any chemical smell for the next meal that would be prepared on that very surface within hours. A cut lemon, rubbed across the same surface once the soda had been wiped away, left it smelling genuinely clean without the sharp, artificial scent that comes rolling out of a modern spray bottle the moment you press the trigger. This took under 3 minutes for an average farmhouse table, and it was done after every single meal, not once a week, which is a large part of why the house never had the chance to build up the kind of layered grime that seems to need harsh chemicals to shift it today. In households where lemons were scarce, particularly during the war years when citrus fruit was nearly impossible to come by, a small splash of vinegar took its place, and the effect on the wood was very nearly the same. Some farmwives kept a jar of dried lemon peel for exactly this purpose, steeped briefly in warm water to draw the oils back out before it was ever applied to the table. Remember this step, because the same lemon and salt combination reappears later in the routine for a completely different job, and it is where most people are surprised how far to cheap ingredients can stretch. The fifth task, and this is where the story gets interesting for anyone who still owns brass, door handles, or an old copper pan, concerned the metalwork around the house. A paste made from equal parts salt, plain flour, and vinegar, worked into the tarnished metal with a soft cloth and left to sit for perhaps 2 minutes before being rubbed off, brought dull brass and copper back to a shine that most people today assume needs a specialist polish bought from a shop. To achieve this was a weekly task rather than a daily one, but it belongs firmly inside the 30-minute routine, because on the day it was done, it added only a few extra minutes to the total time spent. Victorian households in particular were known for door furniture that gleamed even in the gray northern light. And this paste, or something very close to it, is very likely the reason why that shine has become part of how we picture those homes at all. The same paste worked on candlesticks, kettle handles, and the brass fittings on harnesses and tack, so a single small bowl of it could see an entire household's metal through in one sitting. A very old copper kettle kept in that farmhouse well into my adult years still carried the deep, warm color that only comes from decades of this same weekly paste, never once replaced by anything bought from a shop. That is only the fifth task, and there are 5 more still ahead, so do not go anywhere yet, because the next one changes how you will think about your rugs for good. The sixth task addressed rugs and floor coverings, and this is one that surprises new viewers the most because it involved almost no water whatsoever. Rugs were carried outside, hung over a washing line or a garden fence, and beaten firmly with a cane beater or a stout stick, starting from the top edge and working steadily downward, which forced dust out through the weave rather than pressing it further down into the fibers. In winter, fresh, clean snow was sometimes spread across a rug laid flat on the ground outdoors, then brushed off again after a few minutes because the cold, dry snow drew dirt out of the fibers in a way that damp indoor cleaning could never quite manage. Where snow was not available, a light dusting of dry bicarbonate of soda was worked into the rug with a stiff brush, left to sit for around 10 minutes, then swept and beaten out in the same way. This was not a daily task. It happened perhaps once a fortnight in most households, but it kept rugs looking close to new for years, rather than fading and flattening within a single season the way many do now. Beating a rug properly took a little practice, and my grandfather always said you could tell an experienced hand by the steady, even rhythm of the strikes, never rushed and never too hard in one spot. A good beating done properly outdoors achieved in a few minutes what an hour of indoor sweeping could never quite manage, because the dirt actually left the rug rather than simply moving from one part of it to another. That is only the 6th step, and there are 4 more still to come, so keep with me, because the ordering of these tasks matters just as much as the tasks themselves. The 7th task was the sink and the washing area, which in most farmhouses served double duty for both the dishes and the family's personal washing at the end of a long day. Half a lemon, dipped directly into a saucer, of course salt, was rubbed firmly around the basin and the taps, cutting through hard watermarks and everyday grease in a way that left the metal properly bright without ever scratching the surface underneath. This took perhaps 2 minutes and was done every single evening without fail, which is precisely why hard water buildup, something that plagues so many modern bathrooms and kitchens within a matter of weeks, was rarely ever a problem in a well-kept farmhouse of that era. Yorkshire water runs harder than most people realize, drawn up through limestone country for miles before it ever reaches a tap, and yet the basins I remember from childhood stayed bright, without a single chemical discaler ever entering the house. The 8th task was furniture, and here the beeswax used earlier on the floor did double duty around the rest of the house. A small block of beeswax, warmed slightly by the hand or a low fire, and mixed with a touch of linseed oil, was worked into wooden furniture with a soft cloth, then buffed until the grain of the wood came properly alive under the light from the window. This was not a daily job either. It was folded into the weekly routine alongside the windows and the metalwork. But its effect lasted so long that most farmhouse furniture only needed this treatment 3 or 4 times a year to stay well protected against the damp that crept into every stone cottage across the north of England, winter after winter. Pieces treated this way for decades develop a depth to the wood that shop-bought spray polish simply cannot produce, because spray polish sits on the surface while a proper wax feeds into the grain itself over years of steady care. The dresser that stood in my grandparents' kitchen for the whole of their married life still carries that same deep color today, and it has never once seen a shop-bought polish in all that time. The second method around the house is nearly finished now, but keep listening, because the 9th step is the one people write to me about the most once they try it. The 9th task concerned linen and household cloths, because a house cannot truly stay clean if the very cloths used to clean it are themselves dirty and left to fester in a bucket somewhere. Cleaning rags were washed entirely separately from the family's own clothing, boiled briefly in water, carrying a spoonful of soda crystals, then hung outside to dry in wind and sunlight whenever the northern weather allowed it. Sunlight was understood long before anyone had a proper scientific word for what it was actually doing. To freshen and lighten linen in a way that drying indoors near a fire never quite managed to match. A sprig of dried lavender kept folded in among the clean cloths, kept them smelling fresh for weeks. At a stretch, even through a damp Yorkshire autumn, when almost nothing else dried quickly. On the wettest days, when the washing line was simply not an option, cloths were hung close to the fire on a wooden rack that swung out and back. Close enough to dry quickly, but never so close that scorching became a risk. This was perhaps the most overlooked part of the whole system when I explain it to people now, because a genuinely fresh cloth makes every other task on this list faster and considerably more effective. Even the frost of a cold winter's morning was put to use, since laying a damp cloth briefly out on a freezing line was said to leave it crisper than any amount of indoor drying could manage. A trick my grandmother swore by, even though she could never quite explain why it worked. Keep this in mind, because the final step of all ties every single one of these 9 tasks together, and it is the part that most people trying to copy the old ways get completely wrong. The 10th and final task was simply the order in which everything on this list was carried out. And this is the piece that most people overlook entirely when they try to copy these old methods one at a time without understanding the whole. The hearth was always done first, while the fire sat cold, so that any dust it stirred up had a chance to settle fully before the rest of the house was touched by cloth or broom. The floors were always done last of all, so that nothing carried out afterward could undo the work that had already gone in. Windows, metalwork, rugs, and furniture were folded into set days across the week rather than repeated every single day, which is exactly why the daily routine could stay inside 30 minutes, even though the full list of tasks looks a good deal longer once you see it written out in full. Like this, a family that followed this order without fail kept a home that visitors regularly described as spotless, not because any single method on its own was extraordinary, but because dirt was never once allowed to sit long enough to become a genuine job in the first place. This is the piece I most want you to take from this video, because a person can learn every single method I have described today and still end up with a house that looks no better than before, simply by doing them in the wrong order or letting too many days pass between them. Order and consistency did the real work in that farmhouse, far more than any single ingredient sitting in the cupboard. Anyone can buy salt, vinegar, and a lemon at any shop in the country this afternoon. But the habit of using them properly, in the right order, day after day, is the part nobody can simply hand you in a bottle. I think about this often now, in a country where most people I meet have a cupboard groaning with cleaning products and considerably less free time than my grandparents ever had, despite every promise modern life made that it would leave us with more. What was lost was never the ingredients themselves. Salt, vinegar, and beeswax are still sitting on shelves in every shop in the country, cheap and completely overlooked. What was lost was the routine itself, the plain daily discipline of doing small things in the right order. Before they had any chance to become big things, I have watched people spend an entire Saturday morning fighting a kitchen that got away from them during the week, when 30 minutes, a day spent properly, would have kept it from ever getting away in the first place. That is the part genuinely worth reclaiming, and it costs almost nothing at all to do it. If this is useful to you, there are more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, drawn from the same kitchen table my grandfather first taught me at, in a house that is still standing in the Dales to this day. The old ways are still here. You just have to know where to look